Hello and welcome back. This is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In our newest episode of 10 Questions, we are on to the Roman Empire. One occasionally insane man to rule them all. So, the Roman Empire after Octavian continues to expand for another 100 years. Northern Gaul, North Africa, Britain, the Rhineland, the Danube, Mesopotamia. Some of these areas are rich, most are not. So the empire expansion is no longer equaling endless amounts of money, the way it did when they conquered Carthage, the way they did when they mined all the gold out of Spain, the way it did when they conquered the Greeks and all the Greek cities and all the Greek trade. Britain didn't have any of that. The Upper Rhine, the Netherlands, Belgium today didn't have any of that. And so empire was expanding, but no longer bringing in the huge amounts of money that were going to make Rome rich. So Rome was going to have to generate its own money. It was going to have to generate its own trade. For the first time in 500 years, it was going to have to really build from within. So that explains some of the reforms of Augustus. Augustus is bringing the Roman system from a period of constant war to stability, to not war. And so the first thing he does is impose himself, end the civil wars, which is, to be fair, what most people wanted. They wanted stability. The Senate wanted stability. They didn't want terrorism. They didn't want the civil wars fighting each other. They didn't want these private armies battling away. Roman citizens did not want to have to worry about a Roman army sacking their city. And so Augustus brings stability. And Augustus is going to live to 72 or so. He's going to be emperor so long, most people forgot that the Republic existed. Or the people who remembered the Republic were all gone. We see this kind of thing with other long-lived monarchs, especially Queen Elizabeth II that just passed away. There are very few Britons that remember her father as king. She just outlived. She was queen so long, most people didn't think anyone else could be king or queen. No one else had been on the money in their lifetime. So Queen Victoria did the same thing. She was queen for so long. She was queen some 70 years, 60-something years, that most people who remember her being coronated as queen were dead. That's Augustus. Augustus outlives something like 3 generations of people, of his own family. So his biggest reform is that there's going to be one person that runs the show, and that person's going to have a title called emperor. Now, we understand emperor or czar or Kaiser to be bigger than a king. A king of kings is kind of what we think of emperor to be. A king of lots of people, different peoples, large countries that aren't his own country. That's not what emperor meant for the Romans. Emperor was just a general. Imperator. It was just a general, a successful general. So Augustus is not taking on new powers. Remember, Romans hate kings. Even flirting with the color purple got Caesar murdered by the conservatives. Now, those conservatives have lost. They're gone. The Senate has no authority. But Augustus isn't going to mess around with that. So he takes a title that's very generic. Now, that will be a problem later on, but at the start, it's going to be fine. He's like, I'm not a king. I'm not I'm not taking on the Etruscan powers. I'm not one of these guys. It's still the Republic. See, the Roman Empire was still called a Republic, even though one man was running the show, even though an emperor was running the show. They still called it a republic. So there's a fiction going on of how, even though there is a massive change, Augustus is arguing that there isn't one, that a change hasn't happened. And so the emperor runs the show, the Senate has no authority. Okay. So the Senate continues to exist. It shows up and it doesn't debate laws anymore. It gets a law from the emperor who says, approve this. I think this is the best thing to do. Approve it. And so they approve it. I need more money for the army. Okay, approved. I need more money for this. Okay, approved. They're a rubber stamp. They get to keep their privileges. They get to keep their money, right? Augustus is not going to murder them and take their money. But he takes away their authority. He takes away their auctoritas. There's only one person with auctoritas in Rome, and that's the emperor. So there's no longer a big fish in a big pond. There's now a killer whale in the ocean, and that is the emperor. So who's going to do the work? If the Senate is no longer running the show, who's doing the work? One man cannot run 25, 30 million people stretched across 4,000 miles wide by 3,000 miles north and south. So who's going to run the show? And that's going to be the dynasty. People who are related to the emperor. The best jobs go to family members. Why? Well, loyalty. They're loyal. I can trust my nephew to not revolt against me. Why? Because I know who my nephew is. I know the job I'm going to give him is better than any job he could ever hope to have. And so he's going to be loyal to me because he owes his job to me. He owes his position to me. And so loyalty is more important than skill. We see this with Varus. Varus is Augustus's niece's husband. Who's an accountant. He's a very good, because he gets a lot of, if you look him up, he gets a lot of blame thrown at him. But he's a functionary. He's a good accountant. He's exactly who you want to send to be governor of a province, to get his books in order, to make sure all the taxes are being paid. He perfect in like Asia Minor, perfect in like Tunisia, right? Sicily. That's where you want a Varus. He's loyal. He's good at his job. And Augustus says, okay, Varus, you're good at being an accountant. You are now general-in-chief of my armies up in Germany. Go conquer Germany. And apparently there's a letter, because I've have other historians who have said this, that Varus writes to his niece, his wife, Augustus's niece, and says, I'm not worried. This is going to be fine. I can conquer Germany, because if it was going to be that hard, your uncle wouldn't send me. Your uncle knows who I am. So it can't. It'll be fine. And what Varus did was lead 3 legions into a trap in the Teutoburg forest, and the biggest Roman defeat since Cannae happened. 3 legions were slaughtered in the forest. They were ambushed. They were surrounded. They couldn't form up their lines because they were in the forest, and the officers started committing suicide, while captured soldiers had their heads nailed to trees as a sacrifice to the various different gods, one of which is probably Odin, the Scandinavian Viking god. That ends badly. The Romans are never going to be able to conquer Germany after this. And there's a story I don't know who it's in. Maybe it's Plutarch or it's Livy that talks about in his old age, Augustus roams around kind of in dementia, the palace, banging his head against the wall or banging his head against his head, hand against his head, saying, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." That the loss of 3 legions kind of ruined all of his kind of foreign policy plans in Gaul, in Germany, in the north. But Varus had the very quality Augustus wanted, loyalty. He didn't have the skill. Now, remember, in the Senate, you can get a Cincinnatus. You can get a Scipio who is going to be found to fight Hannibal. You could find somebody in the Senate class or even in the upper plebeian class who could be plucked out of obscurity and has the ability to rally the city and save the country. The empire doesn't have that anymore. The empire has the emperor and the emperor's family. And that's it. So if you're not in the emperor's family, you're not getting one of the best jobs. So what happened to the army? Well, the army becomes a private professional army. It is now its job. If you can get a job in the army, you now serve for 20 years. You make a contract for 20 years. So instead of being conscripted and being a farmer, army, farmer, now you're army. Then with your retirement fund, farmer, merchant. That's what you're going to be. So it's a professional army, which means their job is the military. Every day they are training. Every day they are being better at war. Every day they are working together. They're a modern army. They're our army. So it's unmatched in its power. There is no army like the Roman army at this time. Just like the Assyrians were the same way in their time, and they were just unmatched. The Roman army, one Roman legion, was expected to conquer an entire country. And that's 5,000 people. If you send, when the Hebrews revolt, all of Israel and Judea were conquered by 4 legions. And that was considered like unbelievably a lot that they had to send 4. That's how big the rebellion was. And Hebrews later will go, they defeated us, yes, but it took them 4 legions. 4 legions? That's crazy. Yeah, 4 legions. That's how good we were, right? That's how good it's unmatched. There's just nobody. So unless it does something stupid, like Varus leading his troops into the Teutoburg forest, on an equal plane, it just crushes whoever it's fighting against. It is paid for by the emperor now. It is the emperor's private army. Remember, Octavian inherited half of Caesar's army, private army? He made that army his own, and then he added more people to it. So it's his army. It's not Rome's army. It's not the army of the Senate. It's the army of the emperor. And it is expensive because it's a professional army. Remember, our army costs us $800 billion a year. And you have people who are in the foreign policy world, especially in the conservative foreign policy world, who say that's not enough. You need to spend more. We're only spending 3 times the amount of China. We should spend 10 times the amount of China. But can you spend $1 trillion a year on your army? Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, argues that the more money you give to the army, the less money you have for research and development, for your economy, for your retirements, for your social services, for your society, so that you end up actually getting poorer because the army doesn't make money. But it being expensive is important. Why is it important? It means the emperor always has to find money. Taxes are always going to be high because they have to pay for the army, which makes people grumble, right? They're mad about paying taxes. People have never liked paying taxes. But the emperor has to find money. Just like pharaohs had to find money to build pyramids, emperors have to find money to pay their armies. It's expensive. The result of which is a loyalty of the people in exchange for pay and citizenship. So we get a change in who the army is. The army is no longer Roman citizens, Roman from birth, who are now serving the state because that's what they have to do. It's now non-Romans being hired into the Roman army to become Roman. And after 20 years, they pop out, they get 40 acres, they get a mule, and they get citizenship. And all of their children get citizenship. So the army becomes the number one way of generating new Romans. It becomes the number one form of natio. Now, the officers, especially early on, will be Roman citizens. And they'll be hired because they're good. That becomes the junior officers, your sergeants, your lieutenants, your captains. We're not going to see this level of the army again until the Swedes show up in the late 1500s, early 1600s. So the reforms of Gustavus Adolphus in the 1620s, where you get a professional officer class of the nationality of the army, who are going to stay in the military permanently. So that's how innovative this army is. And you're getting loyalty in exchange for pay and citizenship. And you're making new Romans, and you're teaching people how to be Roman. So what's the advantages of this system? It's going to last for 500 years. What's the advantages? And it's loyalty and stability. Boom, done. The end of the civil wars. We've talked about that. You get peaceful borders, except in Germany, where they're going to eventually end up on the Rhine as their border. There's going to be a running battle in Germany for after Varus's defeat, and they're going to pull back basically to the river and make the Rhine River, this border. Now, that Rhine River is going to become the border between Gaul and Germany, between France and Germany. This contested land for the next 2,000 years. Like, World War II is going to be fought in this same area, just like the wars of Louis XIV in the 1600s were fought in this same area. So that border that the Romans are going to create is going to be a kind of civilizational border in Europe that still exists. The Gallic Romantic world, the French, Italian, Catholic, versus this German, Teutonic, more pagan, more Scandinavian, more Viking, more warlike, Germanic world. And then east of that, in the 900s, in 1,000 years, the Slavs are going to show up. The Russians, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, they're going to show up out of the forests. So we're going to get these major borders that we still have today. But the Romans had no major enemies. There's no major civil. With the conquest of Egypt, there's no major enemy that's going to threaten Rome. There are no more Carthages. So war doesn't affect most people anymore. You don't have to join the army anymore. In fact, the army will be limited to around 250,000 troops in an empire of 25, 30 million, which means most people can't even get into the army if they wanted to move up. There's just not that many spots. So war doesn't, unlike the wars of the Punic and Hannibal that affected everybody, that traumatized everybody, war for the Roman Empire is like war for us. We've been at war the last 20 years. Now, you can make an argument we've been at war much longer than that, but we've been in active war from 2001 to today, because we're still fighting ISIS and various Islamic groups in Syria and Somalia. But we've done that, and less than 1% of Americans have gone to those wars. I haven't gone, and none of you have gone, or almost none of you have gone. Now, I've had students who have gone, And in from 2005, 6 to like 2012, I had a lot of students. I would always have 2, 3 veterans from Iraq, from Afghanistan in my classes. Now I have almost none. There might be 1 or 2. And they're as likely to be veterans who didn't serve in war. They ended up in Korea. They were in the Navy. They were. It's not that they weren't affected by it. It's that they didn't have the battlefield experience. They were doing other jobs. That's very different from my grandfather's generation, where everyone of that generation, my grandfather, his brothers, my grandmother's brothers, their in-laws, their like brother-in-laws and their brother-in-laws, they all served. They were all either in World War II or Korea. They were all affected by war. And my uncle was in Vietnam. Several of my family members, extended family members, were in Vietnam. Whereas none of my friends, well, I can't say that. One of my friends served in Afghanistan. One of my friends in the reserves served in Afghanistan. But nobody else served in the military. So war didn't affect most people anymore, just like it's not affecting us anymore. With a professional army, it simply doesn't impact people because you don't have conscription anymore. You're not serving the state in the same way, which means you have to find something else to do. What's the disadvantages of the Roman imperial system? Well, if you're watching our video, you have an idea because we have Joaquin Phoenix as Commodius, the Emperor Commodius in Gladiator, sticking his tongue out. Ah! Is that how an emperor is supposed to act? King of the world. What is the disadvantage of the Roman imperial system? Well, the emperor is not a king. Rome hates kings, and we talked about this. But that means there's no clear successor. Augustus can't just say, hey, this guy comes next. It doesn't work that way. Since there's no clear successor, there's always the possibility of civil war. This is the way nomadic societies run. Sometimes there is a clear successor. Sometimes you get someone who's groomed to be the next emperor, and everybody accepts that person as the next emperor. Other times, there just isn't. There's 2 brothers, there's 2 families, there's 2 in-laws, and they both want to be emperor, and they don't like each other. So civil war, that's what happens to Attila and the Huns. Attila dies, he has 2 brothers, they break up the Huns. One wants to fight the Romans, one wants to go back to Central Asia. And so what happens is, that's what happens. Boom, they break the Hunnic horde into 2. The Romans and the Franks defeat the one that invades them this a second time, because it's now half as big, so it's easier to beat. And the one that goes off settles. The Hungarians will claim they are where they settle, but they probably settle out in Ukraine. They probably settle out in the steppe of. They go back to the Central Asia. They go back to the steppe of Eurasia. And so civil war is always this possibility. And then there's the possibility of, oh, what if you get a Caligula who's insane? And in fact, Tiberius will tell us he wanted Caligula to succeed him because he knew Caligula was insane, and it would make the historians think about Tiberius better. Caligula is Tiberius's FU to Romans. That's the way to think about Caligula. But after him is Claudius, some stability. But then you get Nero, who starts well, has a nervous breakdown, and just ends in just civil war. The death of his family, the death of the royal family. And now you have different. Now, if once Nero's gone, he doesn't have children. Who succeeds him? Well, if there's nobody from Augustus's family left, any family can take over. Boom, more civil war. So, with the emperor just being a general and not a king, there's always this instability at the top. There's always this like Jenga of trying to keep the system working and hoping it doesn't collapse. But every time there's a new emperor, there's always this possibility Like if you've ever played Jenga, you pull that little rod. Yeah. There's always a possibility of something bad happening. Second is the army is far away and they're separate. They're now on the borders where most people don't live. In fact, army camps become their own cities because there's nothing else around them. So we get Cologne in what is today Germany. We get the cities in Mesopotamia or in the Levant that become major cities because there's an army camp there. And those guys have money, so merchants show up, merchants settle down to sell them stuff, and you get economic activity. But most people are not tied to service, and we just talked about this. They're not tied to the sacrifice. There is no Cincinnatus being able to stand up in the forum and give the speech to rally the men out of patriotism to go fight the Gauls, to go save Rome. You can't have that anymore because most people aren't affected by it anymore. The army is a faraway thing that, other than taxes, doesn't affect most people's lives. Third is the dynasty. You have loyal people, but they're not always the best people for the jobs. We just talked about that with Varus. And fourth, and this is impacting the dynasty, is that the best senators leave Rome because there's no power. You're there to show up, do a trick, rubber stamp a law, and leave. And if you're in an era of Caligula or Nero, you're now a target. Because when Caligula does something crazy and you say, that's crazy, he now has you as an enemy. So the best and most talented leaders leave Rome, where there's no power. Why would you stay? And they leave for the smaller towns, the faraway provinces. Why? So they could be a big fish in a small pond. They can't be a big fish in the ocean if there's a killer whale. The killer whale is going to eat you. So go far away and be a big fish in a small pond, where you become the most important person. Oh, Girl Scouts need to sell their cookies. Let's go to the patrician. Knock, knock, knock. Hello, Mr. Patrician. We're selling Girl Scout cookies. Well, how many do you have? Well, we have 20 boxes. I'll take them all, please. And if you have any more, send them here. I will buy more. I will buy all of the Girl Scout cookies. From just me? No. From all the Girl Scouts in the town. In fact, I will give the Girl Scouts a trip to Disney World. You go, oh, wow, that's awesome. Except Disney World doesn't exist yet, and we don't know where that is, and Florida hasn't been found. But thank you for offering. But that's the idea of the patrician. You have a problem. You want to put on a school play, and it needs money for the costumes. You go to the patrician. And then the school play is put on by Maximus. All right, this school play, just like, remember we did this with the pharaohs? That's what the senators become. They stop being senators, but they stay the richest guy in the small town, which means they solve most people's problems. Most people's problems are fairly simple. They just need money. Patricians have the money. They solve the problems. They get the respect. They get the place of honor. Maybe they get elected mayor. Now, that's going to be a big deal when Rome collapses, because those people are going to become our noblemen. Those people are going to become our lords in the Middle Ages. Those people are going to lead or create an entire country out of those small towns, that small province where they're the big fish. Because when the emperor is gone, who's left? The problem with the senators leaving Rome, though, is there's no backup in times of trouble. If you have a Caligula, you have a Nero, and the Germans invade, there is no Cincinnatus to save you. There is no Scipio to fight Hannibal. There is none. There's Caligula. There's Nero. And that's not going to save you. And so the bench of talent that the Roman Republic had, which was very deep, at least until the 100 years of civil war, becomes extremely thin in the Roman imperial system in time of emperors. What about welfare? We talked about welfare in the days of post-Punic Wars and how welfare was seen as this non-dignified, let people live, give them a little bit of money, give them mostly food. They have to wait on lines. You lost all of your dignity. Everything about welfare told people you were poor. And for guys who had defeated Hannibal, it was an insult. They lost their dignitas. Well, Roman emperors are going to keep welfare. There is going to be welfare. It is going to exist, but it's going to change because Augustus learned they need dignity. They need dignitas. And so what they do is build big things. And this is very important. This is what emperors do. Emperors build big things. They enforce the law, they defeat the enemies, and they build big things. We're going to see, if you ever go to Rome, all of the big things that were built, the Colosseum, Diocletian's baths, the aqueducts, built by emperors. They're going to pay well, very pharaoh, right? They're learning from the 2,000 years earlier of the pharaohs. They're going to pay Roman citizens well, so it's not welfare, it's a job. And all citizens are going to be able to use these things. The pyramids, only the pharaoh got to use it. But Diocletian's baths was for everybody. The Colosseum was for everybody. That's a Republican idea of the Roman Republic. That when you build something, when the government builds something, it belongs to everybody. That's our idea with the national parks. Do you have to pay a nominal fee to go into the parks? Yes, you pay $10. All right. But anybody can afford that. Any U.S. working citizen can afford to enter any of the national parks. In many of the national parks, you could just walk into it free. You have to pay for the car, but you could walk into it or take a bus into it. And that's a Republican idea. That's little r Republican, not the party Republican. It's the idea of a republic, that things belong to everybody. And so what do they build? They build baths for clean bodies and socializing. The Romans were really the first people who had a clean, healthy water supply. They brought water in. That's the aqueducts. The Tiber was not a healthy enough river for a large city, and Rome kept growing. So they literally built rivers in the sky. That's what aqueducts are, to bring water to the city. Instead of people having to go to water, they brought water to the people. Clean water equaled larger cities, less disease. The baths allowed for socializing. You had clean bodies. But also it was a place to hang out. It was a place to do business. It was a place to meet people and network. So the baths weren't just, it was also, it's like a spa. You could get it massaged, but you could also eat good food and all of that kind of like, it wasn't just the pools where you hung out or you did some swimming. It was an entire socialization. The Circus Maximus would hold 100 to 125,000 people for chariot races. See the movie Ben-Hur. And chariot races are the most popular sport in Rome, by far. All of the hype goes to the Colosseum and the blood sport entertainment, which is good, but it was really the horse races that were the main event, that were the main attraction. So the Circus Maximus holds 125,000 people. The Colosseum holds 50,000 people. And so you have these large things that lots of people can use. The clean water is free. We still have clean water. You can walk into the hallway in Madison Hall, walk to the end of the hallway, there's free water. Free, endless water. You get free, clean, drinkable water in most public buildings in America, in Europe. Rome still has its fountains where you could just go, and I've watched people go and they just take a glass of water, they fill up their water bottle, they give it to plants, they drink it themselves. It's not from an aqueduct anymore. It's now piped in. Like New York's has the viaducts, which are underneath the earth, that are now tunnels that are dug out, that go all the way up to the Catskills, that go up to the reservoirs. So New York City, despite being a city of 8 million people, has incredibly clean water because it has the water of the mountains that's piped down. They did that in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So we have Augustus. Then we have a series of emperors that are not as good as Augustus. Tiberius, who turns into a mean SOB at the end and murders a lot of his family. He was Augustus's son-in-law, but didn't really like his wife, and his wife had lots of affairs. And it's a thing. It's a story in Livy, and it's very good. It's actually Augustus's daughter had several husbands because Augustus kept marrying her to his allies, and he kept breaking up with those allies because he lived too long. And so basically it's a story of Augustus's daughter, Julia, I think is her name, taking back her sexuality, being like, well, if you're going to use my sexuality as a prize, I'm going to take it. I'm going to use it with men I want to use it with. And she ended up, like, Augustus couldn't murder his own daughter, so he ended up exiling her with her favorite lover to Capri, to an island paradise in southern Italy, where Tiberius's hitmen will eventually murder both of them. Then we get Caligula, who's flat out insane. We get Claudius, who we like, but was considered a mama's boy and too dependent on the love of women for approval. He also had a clubbed foot. And so the Romans didn't really like him. There's Robert Graves' book, I, Claudius, which is also became a BBC series. I think it's Patrick Stewart is in it. A bunch of the British actors from the 70s are in it. 70s and 80s that you will recognize are in it as young people. But modern people like Claudius, but the Romans didn't really respect him. He wasn't Augustus. He wasn't Caesar. He wasn't, Scipio, who defeated Hannibal. He just wasn't a manly man in the way Roman masculinity defined it. He just didn't fit the role of an emperor. So, he had the ability, but he didn't have the personality, the PR for it. So then we get Nero, and when Nero starts, Nero's pretty good. Everyone likes Nero. He's a young man. He's got a nice wife. The problem is that his mama wanted to run the empire instead of him, and he tries to murder his mom like 7 times. Like 7 different times. And she won't die. Like, no matter what he does, she won't die. And it's like, well, why doesn't he just, stab her? Well, you can't murder your mother in Rome. Like, you just can't do that. So, they do all kinds of, traps and, all kinds of, they build a boat that sinks. That's purposely built to sink. And Nero's like, Mom, I built you a boat. Go take a pleasure cruise. And she's like, oh, okay, that's great. And she goes off onto the Tiber, and Nero and his homeboys are sitting there, and they're having their lunch, and they're like, watch this. This is going to be great. And the boat is going lower into the water and lower into the water and sinks. And the idea was nobody knows how to swim. In the ancient world, they just don't. And Roman patrician women wore all the heavy silks from China. They wore the heavy robes. So the idea would be they would be inundated, be dragged down. They would drown. And that would be the end of his mother, and it would be an accident, and oh, well, you know. And then Nero could run the empire by himself, and no one would call him a mama's boy like they called Claudius, right? And wouldn't you know it, this woman, this patrician woman, swims to shore in her robes, swims to shore, gets out on the beach, goes to Nero and goes, you have to murder those architects. You have to murder those shipwrights. They built a boat and it almost got me killed. And Nero just loses his mind. Of course he has to murder. Of course he puts on trial the shipwrights and the architects who are like, we did what you wanted to do. It worked perfect. We built you the perfect boat. We got you. He executes them, right? And he just has a nervous breakdown. Nero clearly, I think in the modern, but we shouldn't try to mentally analyze, psychologically analyze. Like there's a rule for psychologists that shouldn't do it, and I'm a historian, so. But it's very clear that Nero has a break. Nero starts good and just becomes Nero. Now, a lot of the bad stuff about Nero comes from the Christians who were persecuted by Nero. So he gets a lot of bad press from that, and that's where most people know the bad stuff from. But Nero clearly has a break. Something happens to Nero. Now, after that, there's a civil war between different generals. There's a civil war to kill Nero, and then a civil war to replace Nero. And then there's a bunch of different generals that take over. There's a new family that takes over for a little while. And then what you get is a series from 96 to 180 AD for 100 years of the good emperors. A series of emperors, none of which is the son of the previous emperor. They're all kind of selected as an heir. And it's stability. And you get what's called the Pax Romana. It is the height of Roman civilization. It's 100 years of Roman peace, from 96 to 180. If you want to live in the Roman Empire, this is the time to live. This is it. If you wanted to fight for the Roman Empire in its glory days, that's Cincinnatus. I wouldn't want to fight in the Punic Wars. You're likely to be dead. So, that's like saying I want to fight in World War I. Like, no, you really don't. But when you think of the Roman Empire, when you think in your mind, when you see Rome, this is what you see. The Pax Romana, the 100 years of Roman peace. There's no war. There's wars, but they're on the borders. There's no major civil war. There's no major conflict that you need 1 million men under arms. So people don't fight in the empire anymore. Greeks are not fighting Greeks. Egyptians aren't fighting Seleucids, right? The North African tribes are Roman now. They've settled down. They're in cities. They're not fighting each other. Which is a crisis. This no war is a crisis of masculinity. What do? The Gauls defined themselves by war. The greatest warriors were the most important men. The Greeks, you got citizenship by joining the army. Now you don't fight, so there's no army. There's no Greek army anymore. There's no Athenian or Spartan or Corinthian army. So there's a crisis of masculinity. What are you supposed to do with your life if you're not going to war? And what people do is invest in their future. Mostly they invest in education and business because now they have a future. You are investing in your future. Why? Because you think you have one. If you were going to go to war in June, you would not be in my class. You would be in a Maserati down the shore. And you'd be right. Because if you go off to war, you don't know if you're coming back. So you might as well enjoy your life. Why would you invest in something that's not going to pay you back for 20 years, like a business? Why would you buy an education you're not going to use? Well, now, with no war, no major wars, you can invest in your future. You do have a future. So people invest in education, in business, which creates more wealth for people. because education is always, always, always gets better jobs. Always gets better jobs. And you get more culture, especially Greek culture. Because, well, what are you going to study? What culture do you want? The Greeks have the great culture. The Greeks have the best culture. They have the plays. They have the poetry. They have the education. They have Aristotle. So you're going to get more culture. You're going to have a better life. This time period, from Augustus, really, from 27 BC to 180 AD, were the first generations who had the problem of what to do with their future time, of what to do when you grow up. Everyone else just went to war, and if they lived, they went back to farming, or they died, or after farming, a couple of years later, they went and did it again. The Greek men are go to war every year or 2 years. They're going to get up in their phalanx. Men were fighting all the time, 6 years at a time. And then they settled down, they went to farming, but if the Gauls invade, you'd be back in the army. So the era of the Pax Romana is the first era of real peace. And we see this in the culture. Well, let me go back. I'm going to go back for a second because there's Monty Python and the Life of Brian, where a revolutionary Jewish group is talking about kicking out the Romans, kicking the Romans out of Judea. And the leader of the rebellion, the leader of the group, asked the question, what have the Romans ever done for us? They've conquered us. They've oppressed us. What have the Romans done anything good for us? And in the crowd, someone goes, the education, water, the aqueducts, the baths. And so John Cleese hilariously sets up it all. After all these guys mention all these things, he's like, fine. All right. But apart from the sanitation, the medicine, the education, the wine, the public order, the irrigation, the roads, the fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? And the idea of this is they're in the Pax Romana. They brought civilization. They brought a better way of living. They brought a Roman lifestyle to everybody else. They brought aqueducts. They brought engineering. They brought education. They brought Italian and Greek wine, which everybody loves. They brought the roads so you could connect. St. Paul is able to go from Judea to Asia Minor to Greece, and then when he's arrested, to Rome on Roman roads. You can move. You could find a better life. You weren't stuck in your little town anymore. The Romans kept the peace. Nobody fought anymore. Nobody fought with their neighbors. That doesn't mean there's no crime. That's fighting at a very, very, very local level. But there's no like Athens versus Sparta. Egypt versus Judea. There's none of that anymore. There's no Latins fighting each other. They're all Roman. And we see this in the new culture of the Pax Romana. Virgil, the great poet of the Roman Empire, writes the Aeneid. And the Aeneid is where we get the fall of Troy. It is where he covers Homer. He is the Jimi Hendrix to Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. Homer writes the Iliad, and then he writes the Odyssey where he talks about that there's a Trojan horse. But you don't know how it worked. You don't know. It's a reference. Virgil is going to tell you how it worked. He's going to take Homer's ideas and build upon them and make them Roman. And the reason for this is Rome is now an empire. So Rome needs a heroic origin tale. And the origin tale Virgil has is that they're descended from the Trojans. Aeneas, a warrior in the Trojan, in Homer, who is a homeboy of Hector, escapes the fall of Troy. he ends up in a couple places. One of them is Carthage, where he meets Queen Dido. And he helps start Carthage. And then he's like, baby, I got to move on. I got to move on. I got to be Aeneas. And he moves on to this little dinky town on the Tiber River. And that's Rome. And he founds Rome. So what does this mean? Why does Virgil do this? Well, one, it's the idea that Rome is great and was always going to be great. Of course it was going to be great. It's descended from the Trojans, a great people of Homer. Of course it was going to be great. And we could take pride in that greatness. We're not Greeks. We're Trojans. And okay, we suffered, our ancestors suffered the fall of Troy and were cast out. But guess what we did? We got revenge. Rome's empire was revenge for the Greek sack of Troy. See, we're the good guys. We batter down Greek cities. We murder lots of Greek towns. We pick up their people. We enslave their teachers. We move their entire theaters. But we're the good guys, see? It also explains why Carthage came so close to winning. Cousins. Of course Carthage came close to defeating us. We're humble. We're cousins. We're the same. We're descended from the same dude. Of course we are. That explains it. Nobody else could compete with us. But it makes sense that Carthage came close. They're us. Of course. And so what Virgil is doing is giving this origin story for Romans that connects them to the Greeks, that explains the wars with Carthage, that nobody's alive to remember, but is now stories, right? Of Hannibal and Scipio and the Battle of Cannae, where 70,000 Romans die fighting, right? Those are now myths. Those are now stories. Those are now histories that students are being told about. And so this is a literary way of explaining, well, why? Why did these Hellenized Phoenicians on the coast of Africa almost conquer Rome? Well, they're part Roman, so it makes total sense. We're descended from the same ancestor, Aeneas, who we're all descended from Troy. Now none of that is true. None of it is true. But it didn't matter. It's the story that makes you feel good. There's also Plutarch and Tacitus. Plutarch is a biographer. He's going to teach young people how to be valuable adults. So you're in elementary school and you're like, well, what does it mean to be a Roman? What does it mean to be a Roman adult? How should I act? How should I behave? That's where the teacher's like, Plutarch. Drops down Plutarch's Lives. He's like, all right, we're going to teach you about being great and being infamous and being not so great. And so Plutarch is his biographer, and he tells wonderful stories. If there is a sexy story from the ancient Greek and Roman world, it's probably from Plutarch. Like, I want to say Nero trying the ship and Nero trying to kill his mother. I want to say it's in Livy, but I'm almost certain it's in Plutarch. Plutarch is definitely the dude you want to bring in for a dinner party, and you sit him in the middle and just let him tell his stories while everyone else drinks and has their roast duck and roast chicken. Like, you just listen to him tell stories. But the idea was to teach them by using the examples of Greeks and Romans. Do what they did and avoid their mistakes, especially hubris, especially thinking that you're better than you are and that you deserve certain things. So the Romans are going to pick up the Greek idea of hubris as something bad. And they had that. They had that for a long time because, remember, they don't have kings. So there's no one person who can say, I am better than everybody else. And then the idea of hubris is, now that you have an emperor, it's supposed to keep the emperor humble, right? He's just a citizen. He's just a general. He's not really that special. That doesn't always work. See Caligula and Nero. But that's the idea. That's hubris was going to keep you in line. So Tacitus is a sociologist. So if Plutarch is trying to teach young Romans how to be a Roman, how to act like Scipio. Americans used to do this with Washington and Jefferson. And we used to have the great men, and you used to get their biographies, and you'd have Washington, and this is how he behaved, and this is the great things he did. But then you'd have Aaron Burr. Like, don't be Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was selfish, and Aaron Burr tried to run for president against Jefferson, his own president. He was supposed to be vice president, but now he's trying to be president. He's trying to overthrow Jefferson. He, in fact, tries to break up the United States by having a breakaway province in Alabama, Mississippi, somewhere in the South, which would have been in the Southwest in the early days. But in the 19th century, you got a lot of these books of like great Americans and how to act like them, and not so great Americans and how not to be like them. That's Plutarch. Tacitus is the sociologist. Tacitus is trying to tell Romans who they are by comparing them to people who are not Roman. So he compares Roman civilization, behaviors, attitudes to non-Romans, the Germans. This is his book, De Germanica, who the Romans think are inferior. And his basic question is, are they? Are you sure? Because people go, oh, the Germans are barbarians. They don't live in cities. They don't have writing. They don't have aqueducts. They are terrible. They live in filth. And here comes Tacitus going, are you certain about that? Their women are equal. Their men all have a council. They have a democracy. We have an emperor. Do we have a republic anymore? Do you vote for anything? The Germans do. They select their own leader. When was the last time you selected a leader? And so he's our earliest kind of sociologist, where he's comparing not individuals, he's comparing societies. And it's a way of criticizing Rome. Oh, you think you're so good? Look at the people you hate. Maybe they live better. And it's a way of trying to get the Romans to live better, to live more to their ideals. It's a way of criticizing Rome without criticizing Rome. Or he's talking about Romans in other parts of the empire. That's his book, the Agricola, which is in some ways a biography, a little bit of his father-in-law. But it's Romans in other parts of the empire who Romans who live in Rome think are hicks, who think are just dumb mountain folk in the sticks. And that's kind of are they? And we get this today. Maybe the people in the Robi parts of the empire, maybe they're good. We get this. We get this in both ways. We get the coastal elites who think the flyover parts of America are full of dumb hick farmers in Iowa and Kansas, and they're all Republicans who vote stupidly against their own self-interests, and they're just gun-loving, God-living hypocrites who don't have enough teeth. Then you get the opposite, though. You get the opposite attitude of the Midwest Southerns who think the coastal elites are all, daddy warbucks with the mustache that they twirl in the top hat. And they're all like, you hear this on the Fox News. Oh, I have 25 genders, and we have, you have to have 17 different bathrooms, and my pronouns are hate you. They're not even pronouns. And you get that, and a lot of that is stupid. But if you really want that attitude, look at Hallmark Christmas movies. Hallmark Christmas movies will tell you how the Midwest feels about those coastal cities and those elites and those hyper-educated urban folk. And there's your comparison. Oh, watch on Netflix, watch Virgin River. Oh, rural folk are more honest. They're more together. Yes, they're God-fearing, but it also is not hypocritical worship of God. It's a communal worship of God. Um, they're not as selfish. Their lifestyle is slower, but it's also more deliberate. Meanwhile, if you want the opposite of the Hallmark Christmas movies, if you want the coastal urban, watch Sex in the City, watch any Succession, any of the business shows slash things that is all like movements and culture and money and it's yeah, it can be, it does present itself as like sharp elbows and soulless and people are out to get you, but also you get to see the Mona Lisa. You get to be in Paris. Like, look at Emily in Paris, right? And so what Tacitus is trying to do is change people's perspectives. Compare Roman civilization to non-Romans, or to Romans out in the edges of the empire that you don't think about very often. Or when you think about them, you don't have a good attitude towards. Maybe they're not as bad as you are. Maybe the stereotypes that you use aren't quite accurate. And that's what Tacitus is doing. So Plutarch, Tacitus, and Virgil are all trying to teach Romans how to be winners, how to be empire builders, they went from a small city to this global empire. All right, so how do you do that? It's exactly what America was doing in the 1940s and 50s with the universities. How do you be? America went from a very rural place, lots of energetic farmers and southern plantation and slave owning, to a energetic industrial place, to now militarized, the only people who owned nuclear weapons, to running half the world. You can't stay the America of 1920 and 1950. It doesn't work. Americans had to change. But how? And that's where Churchill has his famous line that England will be Athens to America's Rome. America has the power, but England has the experience. England has the culture. And that's pretty much what happened. American universities are going to be modeled on Cambridge and Oxford. American studies are going to be taken over first from Europe, especially from England, and then transformed. American culture is going to transform them into American stuff. And so that's what Plutarch, Tacitus, and Virgil are all trying to do. So does it last? And the answer is no, it doesn't last. And that's where we're going to do our next episode. We're at an hour. We're going to cut off here, and we're going to have a third episode for the fall of Rome. And it's going to start really with the death of the last good emperor, Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor Richard Harris in Gladiator, and the succession not of a picked, well, I guess he is picked, but not of a non-family member, but of his son, Commodius, who Marcus Aurelius is the philosopher king. He's the Platonic ideal of the philosopher warrior king. In fact, writes a book called The Meditations, which is still a good guide to masculinity today. It's the guide to stoic masculinity, to being in control of one's body and one's emotions and how one conducts oneself. It's up to Carnegie's like how to make friends, how to impress others and make friends, or how to Carnegie's book about making friends, and forget the name, but which tried to teach people how to be good, how to do business, how to be an American. You're not a farmer anymore. Here's how you do business, how you do networking. Marcus Aurelius is trying to teach Roman men, how to be dignified men. His son, on the other hand, is literally a Hercules cosplayer. He would go into the gladiatorial events dressed as Hercules. And then, quote, do Hercules' 12 feats. It's like, he was a cosplayer. He's emperor of the world, and what he really wanted to be was at Comic-Con Stage H. That's what he wanted to be. He just didn't have San Diego, Comic-Con, the 21st century. He was just leader of the world of Rome in 180 AD. So a man out of time. And you can imagine the Roman Empire is not going to be very successful under a Hercules cosplayer. And so the wheels start falling off the wagon after 180 with Commodius. And we're going to talk about that in our next episode. And we're going to destroy the Roman Empire. We're going to change Europe. And then we're going to leave. After we finish the Roman Empire, we're going to leave Europe for a while. We're going to go to India and China and the Islamic world. And we're going to kind of leave Europe for a while. So take care, be safe, and I'll see you in the next episode where we destroy Rome.